The dust of the Iowa harvest hung in the crisp October air like suspended gold. It was the season of reckoning, the frantic, exhausting window where a year of gambling against weather, pests, and volatile markets culminated in a mad dash to strip the fields bare. For Mark Hayes, a third-generation farmer staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar operating loan, the margin for error was exactly zero. He sat suspended 10 feet above the earth in the command center of his future, a nearly new $200,000 John Deere 25600 combine. It wasn't just a tractor, it was a rolling data center, a leviathan of green steel and silicon that commanded the landscape. The cab was a sterile sanctuary. Double-paned glass blocked out the roar of the massive diesel engine behind him and the violent thrashing of the 12-row cornhead devouring stalks at his feet. Inside, climate control kept the temperature at a perfect 68 degrees, and satellite radio played softly over the hum of the air conditioning. Mark barely touched the steering wheel. He didn't need to. The combine's GPS-guided auto-steer handled the massive machine with sub-inch accuracy, tracing perfectly parallel lines across the rolling 300-acre field. 3 digital displays glowed brightly to his right, feeding him real-time data, yield per acre, grain moisture content, engine load, rotor speed, and fuel efficiency. It was farming by algorithm, an operation so streamlined it felt almost detached from the dirt below. "Yield map is looking solid on the North 40, Mark said into his Bluetooth headset, his eyes scanning the monitors rather than the field. On the other end of the line, static crackled before his father's voice came through. Caleb Hayes was 65, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease and whose knees predicted weather changes better than the local meteorologist. Caleb was running the grain cart, waiting by the edge of the field in an older tractor to take the load from Mark's combine. "Numbers are just numbers, Mark," Caleb's voice rasped through the earpiece. "You still gotta feel the stalk. You get down and check the cobs behind the spreader, make sure we aren't blowing good kernels out the back?" Mark sighed, shifting in the ergonomic air ride seat. "Dad, the loss monitors are perfectly calibrated. I'm running at 99% efficiency. If a single kernel hits the ground, the sensors tell me. Technology makes this easy. We don't need to walk the rows to know what the machine is doing." There was a long pause on the radio. "Machines only know what the wires tell them, son. But it's your show now. Just keep her moving. Sky's looking a little bruised out west." Mark glanced out the side window. Caleb was right. Above the distant tree line, a dark, anvil-shaped cloud was beginning to crest. It was unseasonably late for a severe storm, but the atmosphere felt heavy, charged with a sudden, unnatural humidity that even the cab's climate control struggled to filter out. Mark checked his radar app. A small, hyper-localized supercell was blooming fast, riding a cold front straight toward their county. "Looks like we might get a little rain, Dad. I'm going to push the speed up a fraction, try to finish this section before it hits." "Don't choke her," Caleb warned. "That green paint doesn't make her invincible." "She can handle it," Mark said, nudging the hydrostatic drive lever forward. The massive engine lugged down for a fraction of a second as more crop fed into the rotor, then seamlessly compensated, RPMs holding steady. The weather deteriorated with terrifying speed. Within 20 minutes, the golden afternoon light was swallowed by an eerie, bruised twilight. The wind shifted, no longer a steady autumn breeze, but a violent, swirling gust that whipped the dry corn husks into a frenzy. The sky turned the color of an old bruise, deep purples and angry slate grays. Mark was deep in the center of the largest field, far from the gravel road and miles from the main equipment sheds. The first drops of rain hit the windshield, fat and heavy, smearing the dust into mud. "Mark, bring it in!" Caleb's voice was urgent over the radio. "Lightning on the ridge. Dump what you have in the cart and shut her down." "I'm too far out, Dad. By the time I navigate to the edge, the ground will be too slick. I'll just wait it out in the cab. I'm grounded in here." "Suit yourself. I'm taking the tractor to the tree line." The rain intensified into a torrential downpour, instantly turning the dry topsoil into slick, heavy gumbo. Mark throttled the combine down to an idle, disengaged the separator, and parked. He watched the storm lash against the thick glass, feeling a profound sense of isolation despite the screens glowing around him. The wind rocked the massive machine, a testament to the storm's raw power. Then the air inside the cab seemed to compress. There was no warning, just a blinding, jagged flash of pure, localized daylight followed a microsecond later by a concussive boom that rattled Mark's teeth in his skull. The lightning strike hit the earth barely 30 yards from the combine's right front tire. The physical shockwave rocked the 20-ton machine. Inside the cab, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every digital screen flickered wildly, emitting a high-pitched electronic squeal before going dead black. The satellite radio snapped off. The air conditioning died. The only sound left was the deafening roar of the rain and the steady, mechanical thrum of the massive diesel engine, which suddenly sputtered, coughed, and violently died as its electronic fuel injection system lost all communication with the primary computer. Silence fell over the cab, thick and suffocating. "Dad?" Mark yelled into his headset. Nothing. The Bluetooth connection was severed. He fumbled for the ignition key, turning it off and then back to the start position. Nothing happened. Not a click, not a hum, not a single dashboard warning light. It was as if the battery had been physically removed. Mark's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He grabbed his cell phone, fingers trembling. No service. The strike had either fried the nearest tower or the storm was blocking the signal. He sat in the darkening, rapidly cooling cab for an hour, watching the rain hammer the corn, flattening some of the stalks, praying it wouldn't hail. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a cold, wet, washed-out landscape, Mark stepped out onto the slick platform outside the cab door. The smell of ozone was sharp and metallic in the air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and crushed vegetation. He climbed down the ladder, his boots sinking into the thick mud. He walked around the machine looking for scorch marks or physical damage. There was nothing visible. The green paint was merely wet. But when Caleb finally arrived, churning through the mud in a heavy four-wheel drive pickup, they quickly realized the true extent of the disaster. Caleb brought a multimeter and a heavy toolbox. They popped the side panels, exposing the complex nervous system of the combine. "Main fuse is blown," Caleb said, his voice grim. He replaced it. Still nothing. They spent the next 2 hours tracing wires. The diagnosis grew worse with every panel they opened. The localized electromagnetic pulse from the near-miss lightning strike had surged through the machine's grounding system. The John Deere dealership technician arrived later that afternoon, his diagnostic laptop in hand. He plugged the umbilical cord into the combine's main port. He tapped his keyboard for a few minutes, frowned, unplugged it, and plugged it back in. Finally, he closed the laptop with a heavy sigh. "I'm sorry, Mark," the technician said, pushing his cap back. "It's a total catastrophic failure of the CAN bus system. The main engine control unit is fried. The cab controller is gone, the sensors on the rotor, the auto steer module, the emissions computer, all of it. It's completely bricked." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. Okay, so replace the modules. How long?" The technician grimaced. "During harvest? With supply chain backups? The main ECU has to be shipped from Moline, and they are backordered. The labor alone to rip out the wiring harnesses and repin the connectors. Mark, you're looking at 3 weeks, minimum, maybe 4, and the parts bill is going to be north of $40,000. 3 weeks. The words echoed in Mark's head, hollow and terrifying. The corn was mature, drying rapidly. If it sat in the field for another month, winter winds would snap the stalks. The ears would fall to the ground, unharvestable. The crop would rot, and if the crop rotted, the bank would take the land. It was that simple. The math of modern farming was unforgiving. "I can't wait 3 weeks," Mark said, his voice cracking. "I'll lose everything." The technician looked away, uncomfortable. "I'll get the parts ordered on priority, Mark. That's all I can do." As the dealership truck bounced away down the muddy lane, Mark leaned against the massive, dead tire of the John Deere. The cold metal offered no comfort. He slid down until he was sitting in the mud, staring blankly at the ruined stalks crushed beneath the combine. The debt, the pressure, the sheer impossibility of it all crashed down on him. He buried his face in his hands. Caleb stood a few feet away, silent. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply watched his son grapple with the crushing weight of nature's indifference to technology. After a long time, Caleb walked over and put a heavy, calloused hand on Mark's shoulder. "Get up, son." "There's no point, Dad," Mark muttered into his hands. "It's over. We can't hire a custom crew. They're all booked solid out of state. We can't rent a machine. We're done." "I said get up," Caleb repeated, his tone shifting from sympathetic to authoritative. It was the voice that had commanded Mark when he was a boy, the voice of a man who had survived droughts, floods, and the farm crisis of the 1980s. "We aren't done until the snow flies." Mark looked up, eyes red. "What are you talking about?" "Come with me." Caleb turned and began walking back toward the farmstead, a mile away. Reluctantly, Mark pulled himself out of the mud and followed, his legs feeling like lead. They walked past the shiny steel grain bins, past the modern insulated shop where they maintained the tractors, and headed toward the back of the property. There, standing behind a windbreak of overgrown cedar trees, was the old implement shed. It was a corrugated tin structure, leaning slightly, its red paint faded to a chalky rust. It hadn't been used for active equipment in over 15 years, relegated to storing scrap metal, old lumber, and memories. Caleb slid the heavy, screeching doors open. The air inside was thick with the smell of dry rot, old grease, and mouse droppings. Only slivers of late afternoon light penetrated the gloom. Caleb walked to the back corner of the shed. A massive, bulky shape sat draped in heavy, dust-caked canvas tarps. "Dad, what is this?" Mark asked, wiping a cobweb from his face. Caleb grabbed the corner of the heavy tarp and pulled. Dust billowed into the air, catching the shafts of light. As the canvas slid away, it revealed a boxy, angular machine painted in the iconic, faded red and white of International Harvester. It was an IH-715 combine. "Granny," Mark stared at it. It was tiny compared to the monstrous John Deere. The cab was an open-air box with a simple metal roof and a glass windshield. There was no auto steer, no climate control, no digital screens. It had a modest, 4-row corn head attached, looking laughably small. "Dad, you've got to be kidding me. That thing hasn't run since I was in middle school." 1998 to be exact, Caleb said, walking around the machine, patting the faded red side panel. "The year before we bought the first rotary combine, I parked her here, drained the fluids, fogged the cylinders, put her up on blocks to save the tires. It's a museum piece. It's scrap metal. We have 1,500 acres of corn left. You think we're going to harvest it with a 4-row antique?" "I think," Caleb said, turning to face his son, his eyes hard and bright, "that it's the only machine on this farm with an engine that doesn't need a microchip to tell it how to spark. It's got a carburetor, a distributor, and mechanical linkages. Lightning doesn't care about cast iron." Mark shook his head, overwhelmed by the absurdity. "Even if we get it running, we'd have to crawl at 3 miles an hour. It would take weeks." "We have weeks," Caleb countered. "The John Deere won't be fixed for a month. We have 2 choices. We sit in the house and watch the bank take the deed, or we get to work. Now, go grab the big air compressor and the pressure washer. I need my red toolbox." The absurdity gave way to a desperate, frantic energy. Over the next 36 hours, the old shed became a surgical theater. The contrast between the 2 generations of farming was starkly illuminated under the harsh glare of halogen work lights. Mark, accustomed to plugging a laptop into a port to find a problem, found himself lost in a world of mechanical grease and brute force. Caleb, however, moved with a practiced, almost rhythmic grace. They started with the basics. They pulled the spark plugs, marveling that the old champion plugs weren't completely fouled. Caleb showed Mark how to use a feeler gauge to gap them perfectly. They drained the ancient, varnished gasoline from the tank, the smell sickly sweet and potent, replacing it with fresh fuel and a heavy dose of carburetor cleaner. "Hand me the 3/4 inch," Caleb grunted, his upper body buried halfway into the engine compartment behind the grain tank. Mark dug through the heavy metal toolbox, the very same weathered red box that would soon sit out in the corn stubble, and handed him the wrench. "The belts are cracked," Mark noted, shining a flashlight on the main drive pulleys. "They'll hold for a bit. We just need to get her breathing first," Caleb said. He emerged, wiping grease across his forehead. "All right, the points are filed. The rotor looks okay. Battery is hooked up. Let's see if she remembers how to work." It was past midnight on the second day. The air in the shed was cold. Mark climbed up the narrow metal ladder into the austere cab. The seat was torn vinyl, exposing yellow foam. The steering wheel was hard, cracked plastic. In front of him were just a few analog dials. Oil pressure, water temperature, amps. A throttle lever and a choke cable sat on the side console. "Give her half choke. Crack the throttle a 1/4 inch," Caleb yelled from down below. Mark pulled the stiff choke cable. He turned the key. The starter motor whined, a high, mechanical grinding sound that echoed loudly in the tin shed. The engine turned over slowly, sluggishly. "Brrrr!" "Keep cranking," Caleb shouted. He sprayed a blast of ether starting fluid directly into the air intake. Mark turned the key again. The starter strained. Then, a sharp, violent pop echoed from the exhaust, followed by a puff of white smoke. "She's getting spark," Caleb yelled, grinning. Again, Mark cranked it. The engine sputtered, caught for a second, shuddered violently, and died. "The carb is gummed up. Needs more persuasion," Caleb said, grabbing a rubber mallet. He tapped the side of the carburetor bowl rhythmically. "Try it now." Push the choke in halfway once she catches. Mark turned the key. The starter whined. The engine sputtered. Pop, pop, bang. And then, with a deafening, unsilenced roar, the old gasoline engine exploded to life. A massive cloud of blue and black smoke blasted out of the exhaust pipe, filling the shed with the acrid, choking smell of burnt oil and unburnt fuel. The entire machine vibrated intensely. Loose metal panels rattled, but the RPMs climbed, stabilizing into a loud, rhythmic, mechanical thrum. It wasn't the smooth, quiet hum of modern diesel. It was a loud, aggressive clatter of valves and pistons. It sounded angry. It sounded alive. Mark pushed the choke in. The engine settled into a loud, fast idle. He looked down at the gauges. The needle on the oil pressure dial slowly crept up into the green zone. The alternator gauge showed a positive charge. Down on the floor of the shed, Caleb stood in the cloud of blue exhaust smoke. He looked up at Mark sitting in the dusty cab, the halogen lights casting long shadows across his grease-streaked face. Caleb didn't say a word. He just nodded slowly, a fierce, determined smile breaking across his weathered features. The green beast was dead in the mud, but Granny had just woken up. The harvest wasn't over. It was just beginning again. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the frost-kissed corn stubble. It was a clear, bitter day, the kind of morning that usually signaled a fast, efficient harvest in the climate-controlled comfort of a modern machine. Instead, Mark Hayes stood shivering in his heavy Carhartt jacket, his breath pluming in the crisp air, staring at a tableau that felt plucked from a different century. To his left sat the John Deere 25600. It was a $200,000 monument to technological fragility, its massive green flanks streaked with dried mud, its computer brains utterly dead from the lightning strike. It looked like a beached whale, magnificent but entirely useless. To his right, idling with a loud, rhythmic clatter that shook its faded red sheet metal, was Granny. The 1970s International Harvester 715 combine smelled of raw gasoline, hot oil, and decades of settled dust. There were no sleek lines, no GPS domes, no tinted glass. It was a box of exposed belts, spinning pulleys, and sheer mechanical stubbornness. Up in the open-air cab, sitting on the torn vinyl seat, Caleb Hayes gripped the thin, hard plastic steering wheel. He wore his faded camouflage cap pulled low, and for the first time since the storm hit, a wide, genuine smile broke through the deep creases of his weathered face. He looked down at Mark, his eyes bright with a mix of vindication and profound relief. It was a look that said, without a single word, that the old ways still held value. Mark managed a tight, stressed nod, though his stomach churned with anxiety. He walked over to the black plastic tool chest they had dragged out to the field, a stark contrast to the old red metal toolbox Caleb preferred, and picked up a grease gun. "She's up to operating temperature," Caleb yelled over the deafening roar of the gasoline engine leaning out of the cab. "You ready to see how we used to pull a crop out of the dirt?" Mark climbed up the narrow metal ladder, standing on the small platform outside the cab enclosure. "It's a 4-row head, Dad. The Deere had a 12-row. We're going to be out here until Thanksgiving. The bank is going to start calling next week." "Then we'd better not waste daylight," Caleb said, his smile fading into a look of hard determination. He slammed the heavy gearshift lever into first. With a lurch that nearly knocked Mark off his feet, the old machine bit into the earth and began to roll forward. Caleb reached over and pulled a heavy mechanical lever to engage the separator. The noise was incredible. Without sound-deadening insulation, the roar of the cylinder threshing against the concaves was a physical force. Dust immediately billowed up from the feeder house, swirling into the cab and coating their clothes and faces. They hit the first rows of standing corn. The small, rust-pitted snouts of the header parted the stalks. Mark watched, mesmerized and horrified as the machine chewed into the crop. It was agonizingly slow. Where the John Deere would cruise at 7 or 8 miles an hour, devouring massive swaths of the field in silent efficiency, the IH-715 crawled at barely 3 miles an hour. "Listen to her!" Caleb shouted over the din, tapping his ear. "I can't hear anything else," Mark yelled back. "No, listen to the cylinder. You hear that low growl? That drop in pitch?" Caleb eased back on the manual throttle just a fraction of an inch. "That means she's slugging, taking in too much stalk. You don't have a computer to adjust the rotor speed for you out here. If you don't listen, you'll choke her, plug the whole system, and we'll spend half a day digging rotting corn out of the rotors with a pry bar." Mark nodded slowly, tuning his ears to the mechanical symphony. He realized that operating this machine wasn't about monitoring data on a screen. It was a physical partnership. The combine communicated through vibrations in the floorboards, the smell of the exhaust, and the pitch of the threshing cylinder. For the first 3 days, the pace was maddening. Mark felt the crushing weight of his debt with every slow, dusty pass across the field. He would sit in the grain cart tractor, watching his father crawl back and forth, calculating the math in his head. At this rate, harvesting the remaining 1,500 acres seemed impossible. He missed his comfortable cab. He missed his podcasts. He missed the illusion of total control that the digital displays had given him. When Mark took his turn in the combine, his shoulders ached by the end of the day. The steering required genuine physical effort, fighting the ruts and mud without the aid of modern hydraulics. His eyes stung from the relentless dust, and his ears rang long after the engine was shut off. But slowly, a strange rhythm took hold. He learned to steer by the visual line of the corn row rather than a GPS monitor. He learned exactly how far to push the hydrostatic drive before the engine started to bog down. Then, on the afternoon of the 5th day, the inevitable happened. Mark was driving, deep in the middle of the south 80 acres. The machine was running hot but steady. Suddenly, a loud, violent thwack echoed from the right side of the combine, followed immediately by the acrid, choking stench of burning rubber. The entire separator mechanism shuddered and ground to a sudden, terrifying halt. Mark instinctively slammed the main drive lever into neutral and pulled the engine kill switch. Silence fell over the field, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of boiling coolant in the radiator. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Mark's chest. He practically threw himself out of the cab and scrambled down the ladder. He ran to the side of the machine and threw open the heavy metal shielding. The main drive belt, a massive, thick loop of reinforced rubber that powered the threshing cylinder, had snapped clean in half. It lay in the dust like a dead black snake. Worse, the idler pulley that tensioned it was hanging at a crooked angle, its bearing completely blown out and seized tight. "No," Mark whispered, his hands gripping his hair, the dust on his face streaking with sweat. "No, we're done." He kicked the massive rear tire of the combine. The fragile hope he had built over the last few days shattered. A broken main drive and a seized pulley on a 50-year-old machine meant finding obsolete parts. It meant days of downtime. The John Deere was dead, and now Granny was dead too. The bank would take the farm. Caleb pulled up in the grain cart tractor a few minutes later. He climbed down, his face unreadable as he assessed his son's panic and the open side panel of the combine. "It's over, Dad," Mark said, his voice shaking. Main belt snapped. "The tensioner bearing is disintegrated. We can't order that part. We can't fix this with a laptop." Caleb didn't say a word. He walked slowly to the back of his pickup truck parked at the edge of the field and pulled out the heavy, weathered red toolbox. He carried it over and set it down in the dirt next to the broken combine. He popped the latch and flipped the lid open. Inside was a chaotic jumble of wrenches, pry bars, vice grips, and odds and ends that looked more like junk than tools. "A computer," Caleb said quietly, pulling out a heavy steel pry bar and a roll of thick baling wire, "would tell you this machine is dead. It would flash an error code and lock you out until a certified technician drove out here and charged you $200 an hour to replace a module." Caleb knelt in the dirt. He reached into the bottom of the toolbox and pulled out a spare belt. It was old, dusty, and stiff, but intact. "But this ain't a computer, Mark. It's just iron and tension." For the next hour, Mark watched in stunned silence as his father performed a miracle of field expedient engineering. Caleb couldn't fix the blown bearing on the idler pulley, so he bypassed it entirely. He used the pry bar to bend the mounting bracket out of the way. Then he found a thick block of hard oak wood in the bed of his truck. Using heavy bolts, washers, and generous wraps of baling wire, he fashioned a stationary, smooth wooden block exactly where the pulley used to be. He wrestled the stiff, spare belt onto the main drive wheels, rooting it tightly over the smooth, greased surface of the oak block to maintain tension. "It's going to rub," Mark said, pointing at the makeshift tensioner. "It'll burn through that wood in a day." "It'll burn through it in 3 days," Caleb corrected, wiping grease on his jeans. "By then, I'll have a machinist in town mill us a new bracket and press a new bearing. But for the next 3 days, it'll spin." Caleb stood up and pointed to the cab. "Fire her up." Mark climbed into the cab, his heart in his throat. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. He slowly, gently engaged the separator lever. The machine shuddered. Down below, the belt shrieked for a fraction of a second as it gripped the pulleys and slid over the greased oak block. Then, the rhythmic, deafening clatter of the cylinder returned. The belt held. The machine was alive. Mark looked down at his father standing in the dirt. Caleb gave him a curt nod and pointed toward the uncut corn. "Get back to work." As Mark drove back into the stalks, a profound shift occurred in his perspective. He looked at the crude, exposed linkages, the analog dials, and the dusty metal. He had spent his entire adult life believing that farming was about outspending the elements, buying enough technology to insulate the farm from risk. If the soil was dry, you bought precision irrigation. If the yield was low, you bought hyper-engineered, genetically modified seed. If the harvest was tough, you bought a machine with a bigger brain. But staring out at the slow, steady progress of the old IH-715, he realized the flaw in his philosophy. Technology was powerful, but it was fragile. When the central node failed, the entire system collapsed. His $200,000 combine was defeated by a single atmospheric spark. His father's approach was different. Caleb didn't rely on systems, he relied on mechanics. He understood the fundamental physics of the machine. He could touch the problem and bend the metal to his will. It was a resilience born not of microchips, but of grit, calluses, and a deep, tactile understanding of the physical world. The financial pressure was still an immense weight on Mark's chest, but the paralyzing fear was gone. They were slow, but they were moving. They were fighting back. By the third week of November, the weather turned hostile. The radio crackled with warnings of a massive early winter storm dropping down from Canada. They had 72 hours before a foot of snow and sub-zero temperatures would hit the county, effectively ending any chance of harvesting the remaining 200 acres. "We don't stop," Caleb announced, looking up at the gray, heavy sky. "We run her 24 hours a day until it snows or she blows." They settled into a grueling, relentless rhythm. Caleb took the day shifts, navigating the rough fields under the pale winter sun. Mark took the night shifts. Driving the old combine at night was an exercise in sensory deprivation and hyperfocus. The original halogen headlights were pitifully dim, casting a sickly yellow glow that barely illuminated the first 3 rows of corn. There was no auto steer to keep him straight. Mark had to lean forward, his eyes burning, steering by the faint shadows of the stalks against the ground. The temperature plummeted. With no climate control, the cab became an icebox. Mark wore 2 pairs of long johns, a heavy coat, and thick gloves, relying on the ambient heat radiating up from the engine block to keep from freezing. The cold air made the old engine run better, denser, and louder. In the absolute darkness of the Iowa plains, isolated in the roaring metal box, Mark felt a strange sense of peace. The digital anxiety of yield maps and profit margins faded away. It was just him, the machine, and the crop. He was no longer a system manager, he was a farmer, wrestling his livelihood from the earth by the strength of his arms and the endurance of his equipment. On the final night, the snow began to fall. It started as a fine, dry powder, swirling in the dim headlights like static on an old television screen. They had 1 field left, a rolling 40-acre piece behind the main house. Mark was at the wheel. His hands were numb, his shoulders screaming in protest from the manual steering. The snow was sticking to the windshield, forcing him to scrape it away with a gloved hand every few minutes. The old combine rattled and groaned, protesting the cold and the endless hours of labor, but the makeshift wooden tensioner held, and the engine kept firing. Through the swirling snow, he saw the headlights of the grain cart tractor approaching. Caleb pulled up alongside him on the move. They had refined this dangerous, synchronized dance over the past week. Mark swung the unloading auger out, pulling a lever to engage the flow. A golden stream of shelled corn poured from the combine into the cart, illuminated by the tractor's spotlights. "Last pass, son." Caleb's voice barely carried over the roar of the machinery and the wind. "Take her to the fence line and we're done." Mark nodded, his throat tight with a sudden surge of emotion. He turned the combine, lining up the header with the final 4 rows of standing corn. He pushed the throttle forward. The machine bit in. He watched the stalks feed into the cylinder for the last time. He listened to the rhythmic thrum of the engine. He felt the vibration through the floorboards. Slowly, methodically, the old machine devoured the final stretch of the field. When he reached the barbed wire fence at the edge of the property, Mark pulled the hydrostatic lever to neutral. He disengaged the separator. The deafening roar of the threshing cylinder spun down into silence. He reached over and turned the ignition key. The engine coughed, shuddered, and died. The sudden quiet was ringing, profound, and heavy. The only sound was the wind howling across the flat, open land, driving the snow against the tin roof of the cab. Mark sat in the dark, cold cab for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. He let out a long, ragged breath, watching his breath turn to vapor in the freezing air. The crop was in. The loan could be paid. They had survived. He climbed down the ladder, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. Caleb was waiting by the grain cart. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Caleb simply reached out and clapped Mark heavily on the shoulder, his grip firm and warm despite the cold. The next morning, the farm was buried under 6 inches of pristine white snow. The sky was a brilliant, clear blue. Mark walked out of the house holding a steaming mug of coffee. He walked past the main sheds and stopped in the yard. The John Deere 25600 still sat where it had died weeks ago, its massive green frame dusted with snow. It was a marvel of modern engineering, a testament to efficiency and yield optimization. In a week, the parts would finally arrive, and a technician would come to resurrect its digital soul. Mark knew he needed it. The farm couldn't scale or compete without it. But parked right next to it, dwarfed by the green giant, was Granny. The IH-715 was coated in dirt, oil, and snow. The wooden tension block was charred black. The belts were frayed. It looked exhausted, a battered veteran of a desperate war. Mark walked over and rested his hand against the cold red metal of the old combine. He remembered the feeling of the heavy steering wheel, the smell of the exhaust, and the sound of the engine catching on that first night in the shed. Caleb walked up behind him, his boots crunching in the snow. He looked at the two machines, the past and the future, sitting side by side. "She earned her rest," Caleb said quietly, patting the side panel of the old harvester. "I reckon we'll drag her back into the shed before the real winter hits." "No," Mark said, turning to look at his father. "We're not putting her back in the dark. We're going to pull her into the heated shop. We're going to fix that bearing proper. We're going to put new belts on her, change the fluids, and keep her battery charged." Caleb raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You planning on starting a museum, son?" "No, Dad," Mark said, looking back at the massive, silent John Deere, then to the worn, stubborn lines of the old International. "I'm planning on running a farm, and I finally learned that the best piece of technology we have isn't the one with the biggest screen. It's the one that refuses to quit when everything else goes dark." The winter wind blew across the empty, harvested fields, carrying the promise of a harsh season ahead. But as Mark stood shoulder to shoulder with his father, looking out over the land they had fought so hard to save, he felt a deep, unshakable grounding. The storm had come, and the storm had broken them, but they had reached back into the dirt, found their roots of steel and gasoline, and built themselves back up again.